This is part two. Part two of what is God in progressive Christianity. So, infinite mystery. Now, so I was just talking about valuing William Lane Craig's arguments for the existence of God, which includes the Kalam cosmological argument, a brilliant formulation that is intimately related to the first cause argument that Aristotle originated, and that then Thomas Aquinas developed with his 5 arguments brilliantly. So, in fact, that's kind of an insight that I've been really happy and grateful to learn about and understand in greater detail recently. That is, and that relates to this idea of God being infinite mystery. Well, I want to address that issue of infinite mystery because it's really emphasizing the unknowability and what is that? That's disempowerment. And there's a side to infinite mystery, the perspective that God is infinite mystery, that is disempowering. Because in the first place, it's not identifying and relating to Jesus Christ. And and watching Melissa Doherty, a nice enough person, and certainly a genuine, with some aspects that are certainly genuine in terms of her seeking, spiritual religious seeking. But then, she admires people like Alyssa Childers, and so she's, a lot of her Frank Turek, who gets a little bit slightly more conservative than William Lane Craig, slightly less intellectual than William Lane Craig, but and so that whole and the spectrum of people in that area, except for John Lennox, but also John Lennox with his own adherence to a church doctrinal context. That whole range of people is avoiding what progressive Christianity basically identifies with, which is progressive politics in general, and the underlying connections, underlying issues that reflects. Right, so Chris Hedges, Cornel West, Reverend Jim Wallace, Brian L. McLaren, coming over from the evangelicals, Diane Butler Bass, coming over for pretty good, pretty progressive, but a little bit sort of embedded in the Christian and non-political sphere a bit. Marianne Williamson, also A Course in Miracles person who has a slight activist edge to her, so I've touched that's a pretty good representation, and so this crowd then are about at least criticizing injustice, being aware of injustice, and in at least supporting a dialogue and conversation and narrative that is about eco-social justice advocacy, activism and advocacy, protests at the very least, and if they really know what's good for them, economic activism, entrepreneurial activism, social entrepreneurship, advocating for all of that, consumer activism, advocating for all of that as part of lifestyle activism. And so, what is God in all that? So then there are roots to that. Who can I talk about? Cornel West, I can start out with at least. Cornel West then talks about Jerusalem and Athens in his more slightly academic angle, And what else? Well, I start thinking of Josiah Royce, um, and so the who else? Karen Armstrong. I don't recall that she mentioned the Quaker Friends in this book on fundamentalism. So Fritjof Capra doesn't really talk about. He talks about social justice in his systems view of life. He talks about issues of eco-social justice and the problem of injustice and unsustainability. So Fritjof Capra, I'm glad to come back to him, and John B. Cobb for process theology, who articulated ecological civilization with great clarity, talked about transdisciplinary education, and all that coming from, some of that coming from, or much of that coming from, to one degree or another, from A.N. Whitehead, the philosopher, and kind of an interesting discipline, batch of discipline there. And he also recognized William James then, whose views then enter into, with his varieties of religious experience, he was analyzing and evaluating the spiritual religious phenomena related to healing, mind-body healing, spiritual healing, transcendental psychosomatic healing, related to Christian Science in particular and its offshoots. It's not a mystery, or the focus then needs to be grounded. And how can that be grounded? I mean, the Quaker Friends have been a really important part of my own, empirical analysis in recognizing what is the origin of modern social movements. So I have Adam Hochschild's great book, Bury the Chains, which focuses on Thomas Clarkson and does a wonderful job as a historian. Hochschild really brings out all kinds of people involved. But the role then of the Quaker Friends is very clear at the beginning. And now, who are the Quaker Friends? That becomes an important question. And he doesn't get into that. The Quaker Friends were led in being co-founded. This fascinating phrase that is necessary to talk about them. They were led in being co-founded by George Fox. So George Fox is this amazing figure. Just a moment. Yeah, sim, meu filho.
A mãe disse que já passou da hora de buscar o que? No celular dela tá isso.
Você não pode falar para ela que eu estou no vídeo. Por favor, fala para ela que eu estou fazendo um vídeo.
Tá, então eu vou...
And so George Fox then represents this guy who had this insight about spiritual practice in worship and doctrine. He just simplified radically and importantly in worship to silent meditative waiting on the inner light of Christ for God, that went then along with his lifestyle actions, including stopping bowing to aristocrats. We're talking about the 1600s. By around 1650, he was already, he is identifiable as representing the Quakers. And so stopping bowing to aristocrats, valuing individuals and women, and protesting injustice. And then 100 years later, his proteges and their proteges, because the atmosphere of democracy was so pronounced, so well defined, that they don't even identify George Fox as the founder. He's considered one of the co-founders, but certainly deserves being recognized as leading the co-founding. The wonderful world of concepts. We can play with the words and modifiers to create accurate empirical descriptions of alternative arrangements like that and considerations like that. So then God is not just, so in terms of understanding the various, I guess there are various levels of issues to be and concerns that people have in terms of expressing the nature of God, coming from the scientific materialist point of view, right? There's a certain, apparently a certain unfamiliarity with how to approach that, and that's been a lot of what I'm working on. All right, my degree in biological anthropology, having studied the evolution of human speech and symbolic behavior and religious ritual, I mean, just gives me this inclination that I don't see going beyond these people that I've already mentioned in their wonderful work, but then I see this wonderful contribution that I can make with insights based on this background and interests and approach of mine based on my educational background, and then my degree in international relations based on also related to my experience and interest in activist in groups and following not-for-profit public interest groups. So, infinite mystery. George Fox represents this wonderful example. No, we're talking about integrity. The integrity of what? We're talking about the original integrity that Jesus showed. What was he teaching? What was he talking about? What was the meaning of his message? But then in his whole context, we get beyond merely a message. We get to his life, the meaning of his life, his mission, to his message, his teachings, which range from the commandments, two basic loving commandments, developing or putting another loving layer on top of Moses' 10 Commandments, and then the variety of teachings, which include, crucially, the spiritual teachings of the necessity to seek first the kingdom of heaven, clean the cup on the inside. You know, I can give you the references, verse references, Matthew 23 for that, Matthew 6 for the seeking. And then what else? Right? Shine your light in front of others with good deeds. You know, where's this grace? No works. Hey, don't talk about works. Hey, because all that is funded in the end. Fundamentalism, that's a fundamentalist doctrine that's been funded by the right wing. Economic materialism. That fundamentalism is a kind of a smokescreen that the fundamentalists don't even understand or realize for economic materialism. They won't criticize their profiteering business people funders who are behind the anti-communist hateful propaganda, that nationalist propaganda of the superpower Cold War era, right? So I finally made all my connections in my spiritual seeking so that I get righteous. And it's about getting righteous in the end, and dispelling the propaganda, the fears and intimidation that has been communicated along with all the propaganda. With wonderful examples like that is wonderful to point out. Huston Smith, scholar Huston Smith, late scholar, pointed out in his wonderful book on world's religions that Elijah, the prophet Elijah, the Hebrew Jewish prophet, he was considering him a pioneer, the pioneer. I mean, we've got Moses and Joseph at least before him, but sort of moving within the established context of, or the growing context, developing context of the Hebrew Jewish culture, Elijah's mission then, prophetic mission, inspired by God to confront King Ahab at that time, was a social justice a prophetic social justice pioneering kind of moment, and is worth acknowledging for him as an individual. And he was protected by God, and so that is clearly a desirable quality, especially given for anybody that has explored the subject. John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, even Reverend Martin Luther King, John Lennon, and all that whole situation of threat and intimidation at the highest levels, of political and military activity. So, what are we talking about then? This is so those are the fundamentalists about. So then, coming back to George Fox and the Quakers, then what we're seeing then with them is this thing about shine your light in front of others with good deeds to honor God. Matthew 5, and variations on all that. Go and learn then, relating back to the university context, and the role that university education, university-based culture and society, with philosophical scholarship, modernized philosophical scholarship, with empiricism, the role of that in allowing us, giving us all this thought material, this knowledge material that we need to evaluate and we need to classify and categorize in order to understand the levels of analysis, levels of explanation, and the complexity of the details, the interrelationships that all ultimately relate to Jesus and the process of historical sociological modernization, right? That's what we're talking about. All right, 17 minutes here. Stop.